and welcome back to the Reading Corner. I'm your host, Renee. I am here for you every Wednesday reading stories from the public domain. And currently we are on Chapter 7 of The Professor by Charlotte Brontë. So if you haven't listened to the previous episodes for The Professor, you will be jumping in at Chapter 7 if you're listening to this episode. So keep that in mind. And without further ado, let's get into it. Chapter 7. Reader, perhaps you were never in Belgium. Happily, you don't know the physiognomy of the country. You have not its lineaments defined upon your memory, as I have them on mine. 3, nay, 4 pictures line the four-walled cell, where are stored for me the records of the past. First, Eton. All in that picture is in far perspective, receding, diminutive, but freshly colored, green, dewy, with a spring sky piled with glittering yet showery clouds. For my childhood was not all sunshine. It had its overcast, its cold, its stormy hours. Second, X, huge, dingy, the canvas cracked and smoked, a yellow sky, sooty clouds, no sun, no azure, the verdure of the suburbs blighted and sullied. A very dreary scene. Third, Belgium, and I will pause before this landscape. As to the fourth, a curtain covers it, which I may hereafter withdraw, or may not, as suits my convenience and capacity. At any rate, for the present, it must hang undisturbed. Belgium, name unromantic and unpoetic, yet name that whatever uttered has in my ear a sound, in my heart an echo, such as no other assemblage of syllables, however sweet or classic, can produce. Belgium! I repeat the word now as I sit alone near midnight. It stirs my world of the past like a summons of resurrection. The graves unclose, the dead are raised, thoughts, feelings, memories that slept are seen by me ascending from the clouds, haloed most of them. But while I gaze on their vapory forms and strive to ascertain definitively their outline, the sound which wakened them dies, and they sink, each and all, like a light wreath of mist, absorbed in the mold, recalled to urns, resealed in monuments. Farewell, luminous phantoms. This is Belgium, reader. Look! Don't call the picture a flat or a dull one. It was neither flat nor dull to me when I first beheld it. When I left Ostend on a mild February morning and found myself on the road to Brussels, nothing could look vapid to me. My sense of enjoyment possessed an edge, whetted to the finest, untouched, keen, exquisite. I was young. I had good health. Pleasure and I had never met. No indulgence of hers had enervated or sated one faculty of my nature. Liberty I clasped in my arms for the first time, and the influence of her smile and embrace revived my life like the sun and the west wind. Yes, at that epoch I felt like a morning traveller, who doubts not that from the hill he is ascending he shall behold a glorious sunrise. What if the track be straight, steep, and stony? He sees it not. His eyes are fixed on that summit, flushed already, flushed and gilded, and having gained it, he is certain of the scene beyond. He knows that the sun will face him, that his chariot is even now coming over the eastern horizon, and that the herald breeze he feels on his cheek is opening for the god's career a clear, vast path of azure, amidst clouds soft as pearl and warm as flame. Difficulty and toil were to be my lot, but sustained by energy, drawn on by hopes as bright as vague, I deemed such a lot no hardship. I mounted now the hill in shade. There were pebbles, inequalities, briars in my path, but my eyes were fixed on the crimson peak above. My imagination was with the refulgent firmament beyond, and I thought nothing of the stones turning under my feet or of the thorns scratching my face and hands. I gazed often, and always with delight, from the window of the diligence. These, be it remembered, were not the days of trains and railroads. Well, and what did I see? I will tell you faithfully. Green, reedy swamps, Fields, fertile but flat, cultivated in patches that made them look like magnificent kitchen gardens. Belts of cut trees, formal as pollard willows, skirting the horizon. Narrow canals, gliding slow by the roadside, painted Flemish farmhouses, some very dirty hovels, a grey dead sky, wet road, wet fields, wet housetops. Not a beautiful, scarcely a picturesque object met my eye along that whole route, yet to me all was beautiful, all was more than picturesque. It continued fair so long as daylight lasted, though the moisture of many preceding damp days had soddened the whole country. As it grew dark, however, the rain recommenced, and it was through streaming and starless darkness my eye caught the first gleam of the lights of Brussels. I saw little of the city but its lights that night. Having alighted from the diligence, a fiacre conveyed me to the Hôtel de , where I had been advised by a fellow traveller to put up. Having eaten a traveller's supper, I retired to bed and slept a traveller's sleep. Next morning I awoke from prolonged and sound repose with the impression that I was yet in Aix, and perceiving it to be broad daylight, I started up, imagining that I had overslept myself and should be behind time at the counting-house. The momentary and painful sense of restraint vanished before the revived and reviving consciousness of freedom, as, throwing back the white curtains of my bed, I looked forth into a wide, lofty foreign chamber. How different from the small and dingy, though not uncomfortable, apartment I had occupied for a night or two at a respectable inn in London while waiting for the sailing of the packet. Yet far be it from me to profane the memory of that little dingy room. It, too, is dear to my soul, for there, as I lay in quiet and darkness, I first heard the great bell of St. Paul's telling London it was midnight, and well do I recall the deep, deliberate tones, so full charged with colossal phlegm and force. From the small, narrow window of that room, I first saw the Dome, looming through a London mist. I suppose the sensations stirred by those first sounds, first sights, are felt but once. Treasure them, memory, seal them in urns, and keep them in safe niches. Well, I rose. Travellers talk of the apartments in foreign dwellings being bare and uncomfortable. I thought my chamber looked stately and cheerful. It had such large windows, croisées that opened like doors with such broad, clear panels of glass. Such a great-looking glass stood on my dressing-table. Such a fine mirror glittered over the mantelpiece. The painted floor looked so clean and glossy when I had dressed and was descending the stairs. The broad marble steps almost awed me, and so did the lofty hall into which they conducted. On the first landing I met a Flemish housemaid. She had wooden shoes, a short red petticoat, a printed cotton bedgown. Her face was broad, her physiognomy eminently stupid. When I spoke to her in French, she answered me in Flemish, with an air the reverse of civil. Yet I thought her charming. If she was not pretty or polite, she was, I conceived, very picturesque. She reminded me of the female figures in certain Dutch paintings I had seen in other years at Seacombe Hall. I repaired to the public room. That, too, was very large and very lofty, and warmed by a stove. The floor was black, and the stove was black, and most of the furniture was black, yet I never experienced a freer sense of exhilaration than when I sat down at a very long black table, covered, however, in part by a white cloth, and having ordered breakfast, began to pour out my coffee from a little black coffee-pot. The stove might be dismal-looking to some eyes, not to mine, but it was indisputably very warm, and there were two gentlemen seated by it talking in French. Impossible to follow their rapid utterance or comprehend much of the purport of what they said, yet French in the mouths of Frenchmen or Belgians, I was not then sensible to the horrors of the Belgian accent, was a music to my ears. One of these gentlemen presently discerned me to be an Englishman, no doubt from the fashion in which I addressed the waiter, for I would persist in speaking French in my execrable south of England style, though the man understood English. The gentleman, after looking toward me once or twice, politely accosted me in very good English. I remember I wished to God that I could speak French as well. His fluency and correct pronunciation impressed me for the first time with a due notion of the cosmopolitan character of the capital I was in. It was my first experience of that skill in living languages I afterward found to be so general in Brussels. I lingered over my breakfast as long as I could, while it was there on the table, and while the stranger continued talking to me, I was a free, independent traveler. But at last the things were removed, the two gentlemen left the room. Suddenly the illusion ceased, reality and business came back. I, a bondsman, just released from the yoke, freed for 1 week from 21 years of constraint, must of necessity resume the fetters of dependency. Hardly had I tasted the delight of being without a master when duty issued her stern mandate. Go forth and seek another service. I never linger over a painful and necessary task. I never take pleasure before business. It is not in my nature to do so. Impossible to enjoy a leisurely walk over the city, though I perceived the morning was very fine, until I had first presented Mr. Hunsden's letter of introduction, and got fairly on to the track of a new situation. Wrenching my mind from liberty and delight, I seized my hat and forced my reluctant body out of the Hôtel de Blanc, into that foreign street. It was a fine day, but I would not look at the blue sky or at the stately houses round me. My mind was bent on one thing, finding out Mr. Brown, numero blank, Rue Royale. For so my letter was addressed. By dint of inquiry, I succeeded. I stood at last at the desired door, knocked, asked for Mr. Brown, and was admitted. Being shown into a small breakfast room, I found myself in the presence of an elderly gentleman, very grave, businesslike, and respectable-looking. I presented Mr. Hunsden's letter. He received me very civilly. After a little desultory conversation, he asked me if there was anything in which his advice or experience could be of use. I said yes, and then proceeded to tell him that I was not a gentleman of fortune traveling for pleasure, but an ex-counting-house clerk who wanted employment of some kind, and that immediately too. He replied that as a friend of Mr. Hunsden's, he would be willing to assist me as well as he could. After some meditation, he named a place in a mercantile house at Liege, and another in a bookseller's shop at Louvain. Clerk and shopman, murmured I to myself. No, I shook my head. I had tried the high stool. I hated it. I believed there were other occupations that would suit me better. Besides, I did not wish to leave Brussels. I know of no place in Brussels, answered Mr. Brown, unless indeed you were disposed to turn your attention to teaching. I am acquainted with the director of a large establishment who is in want of a professor of English and Latin. I thought 2 minutes. Then I seized the idea eagerly. The very thing, sir, said I. But, asked he, do you understand French well enough to teach Belgian boys English? Fortunately, I could answer this question in the affirmative, having studied French under a Frenchman. I could speak the language intelligibly, though not fluently. I could also read it well and write it decently. Then, pursued Mr. Brown, I think I can promise you the place, for Monsieur Pelet will not refuse a professor recommended by me. But come here again at 5 o'clock this afternoon, and I will introduce you to him. The word professor struck me. I am not a professor, said I. Oh, returned Mr. Brown, professor here in Belgium means a teacher. That is all. My conscience thus quieted, I thanked Mr. Brown, and for the present withdrew. This time I stepped out into the street with a relieved heart. The task I had imposed on myself for that day was executed. I might now take some hours of holiday. I felt free to look up. For the first time I remarked the sparkling clearness of the sky, the deep blue of the sky, the gay, clean aspect of the whitewashed or painted houses. I saw what a fine street was the Rue Royale, and walked leisurely along its broad pavement. I continued to survey its stately hotels, till the palisades, the gates, and trees of the park appearing in sight offered to my eye a new attraction. I remember, before entering the park, I stood a while to contemplate the statue of General Belliard, and then I advanced to the top of the great staircase just beyond, and I looked down into a narrow back street, which I afterwards learnt was called the Rue d'Isabelle. I well recollect that my eye rested on the green door of a rather large house opposite, where on a brass plate was inscribed, Pensionnat de Demoiselles. Pensionnat! The word excited an uneasy sensation in my mind. It seemed to speak of restraint. Some of the demoiselles, externats no doubt, were at that moment issuing from the door. I looked for a pretty face amongst them, but their close little French bonnets hid their features. In a moment they were gone. I had traversed a good deal of Brussels before 5 o'clock arrived, but punctually as that hour struck, I was again in Rue Royale. Readmitted to Mr. Brown's breakfast room, I found him, as before, seated at the table, and he was not alone. A gentleman stood by the hearth. 2 words of introduction designated him as my future master. Monsieur Pellet, Mr. Crimsworth. Mr. Crimsworth, Monsieur Pellet. A bow on each side finished the ceremony. I don't know what sort of bow I made. An ordinary one, I suppose, for I was in a tranquil, commonplace frame of mind. I felt none of the agitation which had troubled my first interview with Edward Crimsworth. M. Pellet's bow was extremely polite, yet not theatrical, scarcely French. He and I were presently seated opposite to each other. In a pleasing voice, low, and out of consideration to my foreign ears, very distinct and deliberate, Monsieur Pellet intimated that he had just been receiving from le respectable Mr. Brown an account of my attainments and character, which relieved him from all scruple as to the propriety of engaging me as a professor of English and Latin in his establishment. Nevertheless, for form's sake, he would put a few questions to test my powers. He did, and expressed in flattering terms his satisfaction at my answers. The subject of salary came next on. It was fixed at 1,000 francs per annum, besides board and lodging. And, in addition, suggested Monsieur Pellet, as there will be some hours in each day during which your services will not be required in my establishment, you may, in time, obtain employment in other seminaries, and thus turn your vacant moments to profitable account. I thought this very kind, and indeed I found afterward that the terms on which Monsieur Pellet had engaged me were really liberal for Brussels, instruction being extremely cheap there on account of the number of teachers. It was further arranged that I should be installed in my new post the very next day, after which Monsieur Pellet and I parted. Well, and what was he like, and what were my impressions concerning him? He was a man of about 40 years of age, of middle size and rather emaciated figure. His face was pale, his cheeks were sunk, and his eyes hollow. His features were pleasing and regular. They had a French turn, for Mr. Pellet was no Fleming, but a Frenchman both by birth and parentage. Yet the degree of harshness inseparable from Gallic lineaments was, in his case, softened by a mild blue eye and a melancholy, almost suffering expression of countenance. His physiognomy was fine et spirituelle. I use 2 French words, because they define better than any English terms the species of intelligence with which his features were imbued. He was altogether an interesting and prepossessing personage. I wondered only at the utter absence of all the ordinary characteristics of his profession, and almost feared he could not be stern and resolute enough for a schoolmaster. Externally, at least, Monsieur Pellet presented an absolute contrast to my late master, Edward Crimsworth. Influenced by the impression I had received of his gentleness, I was a good deal surprised when, on arriving the next day at my new employer's house, and being admitted to a first view of what was to be the sphere of my future labours, namely the large, lofty, and well-lighted schoolrooms, I beheld a numerous assemblage of pupils, boys, of course, whose collective appearance showed all the signs of a full, flourishing, and well-disciplined seminary. As I traversed the classes in company with Monsieur Pelet, a profound silence reigned on all sides, and if by chance a murmur or a whisper arose, one glance from the pensive eye of this most gentle pedagogue stilled it instantly. It was astonishing, I thought, how so mild a check could prove so effectual. When I had perambulated the length and breadth of the classes, Monsieur Pelet turned and said to me, "Would you object to taking the boys as they are, and testing their proficiency in English?" The proposal was unexpected. I had thought I should have been allowed at least a day to prepare, but it is a bad omen to commence any career by hesitation, so I just stepped to the professor's desk near which we stood and faced the circle of my pupils. I took a moment to collect my thoughts, and likewise to frame in French the sentence by which I proposed to open business. I made it as short as possible. "Messieurs, prenez vos livres de lecture." "Anglais ou français, monsieur?" demanded a thick-set, moon-faced young Flamand in a blouse. The answer was fortunately easy. "Anglais." I determined to give myself as little trouble as possible in the lesson. It would not do yet to trust my unpracticed tongue with the delivery of explanations. My accent and idiom would be too open to the criticisms of the young gentleman before me, relative to whom I felt already it would be necessary at once to take up an advantageous position, and I proceeded to employ means accordingly. "Commencez!" cried I, when they had all produced their books. The moon-faced youth, by name Jules van der Kelkov, as I afterwards learnt, took the first sentence. The livre de lecture was The Vicar of Wakefield, much used in foreign schools because it is supposed to contain prime samples of conversational English. It might, however, have been a runic scroll, for any resemblance of the words, as enunciated by Jules, bore to the language in ordinary use among most of the natives of Great Britain. My God, how he did snuffle, snort, and wheeze! All he said was said in his throat and nose, for it is thus the Flamands speak. But I heard him to the end of his paragraph without preferring a word of correction, whereat he looked vastly self-complacent, convinced, no doubt, that he had acquitted himself like a real born and bred Anglaise. In the same unmoved silence I listened to a dozen in rotation, and when the 12th had concluded, with splutter, hiss, and mumble, I solemnly laid down the book. "Arrêtez," said I. There was a pause, during which I regarded them all with a steady and somewhat stern gaze. A dog, if stared at hard enough and long enough, will show symptoms of embarrassment, and so at length did my bench of Belgians. Perceiving that some of the faces before me were beginning to look sullen and others ashamed, I slowly joined my hands and ejaculated in a deep voix de poitrine, "Comme c'est affreux!" They looked at each other, pouted, colored, swung their heels. They were not pleased, I saw, but they were impressed, and in the way I wished them to be. Having thus taken them down a peg in their self-conceit, the next step was to raise myself in their estimation, not a very easy thing considering that I hardly dared to speak for fear of betraying my own deficiencies. "Écoutez, messieurs," said I, and I endeavored to throw into my accents the compassionate tone of a superior being, who, touched by the extremity of the helplessness, which at first only excited his scorn, deigns at length to bestow aid. I then began at the very beginning of The Vicar of Wakefield, and read in a slow, distinct voice some 20 pages, they all the while sitting mute and listening with fixed attention. By the time I had done, nearly an hour had elapsed. I then rose and said, "C'est assez pour aujourd'hui, messieurs. Demain, nous recommencerons et j'espère que tout ira bien." With this oracular sentence I bowed, and in company with Monsieur Pelet quitted the schoolroom. "C'est bien, c'est très bien," said my principal as we entered his parlor. Je vois que monsieur a de l'adresse. Cela me plaît, car dans l'instruction, l'adresse fait tout autant que le savoir. From the parlor, Monsieur Pelet conducted me to my apartment, my chambre, as Monsieur said with a certain air of complacency. It was a very small room, with an excessively small bed. But Monsieur Pelet gave me to understand that I was to occupy it quite alone, which was, of course, a great comfort. Yet, though so limited in dimensions, it had 2 windows. Light not being taxed in Belgium, the people never grudge its admission into their houses. Just here, however, this observation is not very apropos, for one of these windows was boarded up. The open windows looked into the boys' playground. I glanced at the other, as wondering what aspect it would present if disencumbered of the boards. Monsieur Pelet read, I suppose, the expression of my eye. He explained. La fenêtre fermée dans un jardin appartenant à une pensionnat de demoiselles, said he, et les convenances exigeantes. Enfin, vous comprenez, n'est pas, monsieur? Oui, oui, was my reply, and I looked, of course, quite satisfied. But when Monsieur Pelet had retired and closed the door after him, the first thing I did was to scrutinize closely the nailed boards, hoping to find some chink or crevice which I might enlarge, and so get a peep at the consecrated ground. My researches were vain, for the boards were well joined and strongly nailed. It is astonishing how disappointed I felt. I thought it would have been so pleasant to have looked out upon a garden planted with flowers and trees. So amusing to have watched the demoiselles at their play, to have studied female character in a variety of phases, myself the while sheltered from view by a modest muslin curtain. Whereas, owing doubtless to the absurd scruples of some old duenna of a directress, I had now only the option of looking at a bare gravelled court, with an enormous pas de géant in the middle, and the monotonous walls and windows of a boys' schoolhouse round. Not only then, but many a time after, especially in moments of weariness and low spirits, did I look with dissatisfied eyes on that most tantalizing board, longing to tear it away and get a glimpse of the green region which I imagined to lie beyond. I knew a tree grew close up to the window, for though there were as yet no leaves to rustle, I often heard at night the tapping of branches against the panes. In the daytime, when I listened attentively, I could hear, even through the boards, the voices of the demoiselles in their hours of recreation, and, to speak the honest truth, my sentimental reflections were occasionally a trifle disarranged by the not quite silvery, in fact, the too often brazen sounds, which, rising from the unseen paradise below, penetrated clamorously into my solitude. Not to mince matters, it really seemed to me a doubtful case whether the lungs of Mademoiselle Reuter's girls or those of Monsieur Pelet's boys were the strongest, and when it came to shrieking, the girls indisputably beat the boys hollow. I forget to say, by the by, that Reuter was the name of that old lady who had had my window boarded up. I say old, for such I, of course, concluded her to be, judging from her cautious, chaperone-like proceedings. Besides, nobody ever spoke of her as young. I remember I was very much amused when I first heard her Christian name. It was Zoraide, Mademoiselle Zoraide Reuter. But the continual nations do allow themselves vagaries in the choices of names, such as we sober English never run into. I think, indeed, we have too limited a list to choose from. Meantime, my path was gradually growing smooth before me. I, in a few weeks, conquered the teasing difficulties inseparable from the commencement of almost every career. Ere long, I had acquired as much faculty in speaking French as set me at my ease with my pupils, and as I had encountered them on a right footing at the very beginning, and continued tenaciously to retain the advantage I had early gained, they never attempted mutiny. Which circumstance all who are in any degree acquainted with the ongoings of Belgian schools, and who know the relation in which professors and pupils too frequently stand toward each other in those establishments, will consider an important and uncommon one. Before concluding this chapter, I will say a word on the system I pursued with regard to my classes. My experience may possibly be of use to others. It did not require very keen observation to detect the character of the youth of Brabant, but it needed a certain degree of tact to adopt one's measures to their capacity. Their intellectual faculties were generally weak, their animal propensities strong. Thus there was at once an impotence and a kind of inert force in their natures. They were dull, but they were also singularly stubborn, heavy as lead, and like lead, most difficult to move. Such being the case, it would have been truly absurd to extract from them much in the way of mental exertion. Having short memories, dense intelligence, feeble reflective powers, they recoiled with repugnance from any occupation that demanded close study or deep thought. Had the abhorred effect been extorted from them by injudicious and arbitrary measures on the part of the professor, they would have resisted as obstinately, as clamorously, as desperate swine, and though not brave singly, they were relentless, acting en masse. I understood that before my arrival in Monsieur Pelet's establishment, the combined insubordination of the pupils had effected the dismissal of more than one English master. It was necessary then to exact only the most moderate application from natures so little qualified to apply, to assist in every practicable way understandings so opaque and contracted, to be ever gentle, considerate, yielding even, to a certain point, with dispositions so irrationally perverse. But, having reached that culminating point of indulgence, you must fix your foot, plant it, root it in rock, become immutable as the towers of St. Gudule. For a step, but half a step further, and you would plunge headlong into the gulf of imbecility. There lodged, you would speedily receive proofs of Flemish gratitude and magnanimity in showers of Brabant saliva and handfuls of low country mud. You might smooth to the utmost the path of learning, remove every pebble from the track. Then you must finally insist with decision on the pupil, taking your arm and allowing himself to be led quietly along the prepared road. When I had brought down my lesson to the lowest level of my dullest pupil's capacity, when I had shown myself the mildest, the most tolerant of masters, a word of impertinence, a movement of disobedience, changed me at once into a despot. I offered them but one alternative: submission and acknowledgment of error, or ignominious expulsion. This system answered, and my influence by degrees became established on a firm basis. The boy is father to the man, it is said, and so I often thought when I looked at my boys and remembered the political history of their ancestors. Pelet's school was merely an epitome of the Belgian nation. Chapter 8. And Pelet himself? How did I continue to like him? Oh, extremely well. Nothing could be more smooth, gentlemanlike, and even friendly than his demeanor to me. I had to endure from him neither cold neglect, irritating interference, nor pretentious assumption of superiority. I feel, however, 2 poor, hard-working Belgian ushers in the establishment could not have said as much. To them, the director's manner was invariably dry, stern, and cool. I believe he perceived once or twice that I was a little shocked at the difference he made between them and me, and accounted for it by saying with a quiet, sarcastic smile, "Ce ne sont que des Flamands, allez!" And then he took his cigar gently from his lips and spat on the painted floor of the room in which we were sitting. Flamands certainly they were, and both had the true Flamand physiognomy, where intellectual inferiority is marked in lines none can mistake. Still, they were men, and, in the main, honest men, and I could not see why their being aboriginals of the flat, dull soil should serve as a pretext for treating them with perpetual severity and contempt. This idea of injustice somewhat poisoned the pleasure I might otherwise have derived from Pelet's soft, affable manner to myself. Certainly it was agreeable, when the day's work was over, to find one's employer an intelligent and cheerful companion. And if he was sometimes a little sarcastic, and sometimes a little too insinuating, and if I did discover that his mildness was more a matter of appearance than of reality, if I did occasionally suspect the existence of flint or steel under an external covering of velvet, Still, we are none of us perfect, and weary as I was of the atmosphere of brutality and insolence in which I had constantly lived at X, I had no inclination now, on casting anchor in calmer regions, to institute at once a prying search after defects that were scrupulously withdrawn and carefully veiled from my view. I was willing to take Pelé for what he seemed, to believe him benevolent and friendly until some untoward event should prove him otherwise. He was not married, and I soon perceived he had all a Parisian's notions about matrimony and women. I suspected a degree of laxity in his code of morals. There was something so cold and blasé in his tone whenever he alluded to what he called le beau sexe. But he was too gentlemanlike to intrude topics I did not invite. And as he was really intelligent and really fond of intellectual subjects of discourse, he and I always found enough to talk about, without seeking themes in the mire. I hated his fashion of mentioning love. I abhorred from my soul mere licentiousness. He felt the difference of our notions, and by mutual consent we kept off ground debatable. Pelé's house was kept, and his kitchen managed by his mother, a real old Frenchwoman. She had been handsome, at least she told me so, and I strove to believe her. She was now ugly, as only continental old women can be. Perhaps, though, her style of dress made her look uglier than she really was. Indoors, she would go about without cap. Her grey hair strangely dishevelled then, when at home, she seldom wore a gown, only a shabby cotton camisole. Shoes, too, were strangers to her feet, and in lieu of them she sported roomy slippers, trodden down at the heels. On the other hand, whenever it was her pleasure to appear abroad, as on Sundays and fête days, she would put on some very brilliant coloured dress, usually of thin texture, a silk bonnet with a wreath of flowers, and a very fine shawl. She was not, in the main, an ill-natured old woman, but an incessant and most indiscreet talker. She kept chiefly in and about the kitchen, and seemed rather to avoid her son's august presence. Of him, indeed, she evidently stood in awe. When he reproved her, his reproofs were bitter and unsparing, but he seldom gave himself the trouble. Madame Pelé had her own society, her own circle of chosen visitors, whom, however, I seldom saw, as she generally entertained them in what she called her cabinet, a small den of a place adjoining the kitchen, and descending into it by 1 or 2 steps. On these steps, by the by, I have not unfrequently seen Madame Pelé seated, with a trencher on her knee, engaged in a threefold employment of eating her dinner, gossiping with her favourite servant, the housemaid, and scolding her antagonist, the cook. She never dined, and seldom indeed took any meal with her son, and as to showing her face at the boys' table, that was quite out of the question. These details will sound very odd in English ears, but Belgium is not England, and its ways are not our ways. Madame Pelé's habits of life, then, being taken into consideration, I was a good deal surprised when one Thursday evening — Thursday was always a half-holiday — as I was sitting all alone in my apartment, correcting a huge pile of English and Latin exercises, a servant tapped at the door, and on its being opened, presented Madame Pelé's compliments, and she would be happy to see me and take my goûter, a meal which answers to our English tea, with her in the dining-room. "Plaît-il?" said I, for I thought I must have misunderstood. The message and invitation were so unusual. The same words were repeated. I accepted, of course, and as I descended the stairs, I wondered what whim had entered the old lady's brain. Her son was out, gone to pass the evening at the Salle of the Grande Harmonie, or some other club of which he was a member. Just as I laid my hand on the handle of the dining-room door, a queer idea glanced across my mind. "Surely she's not going to make love to me," said I. "I've heard of old Frenchwomen doing odd things in that line. And the goûter? They generally begin such affairs with eating and drinking, I believe." There was a fearful dismay in this suggestion of my excited imagination, and if I had allowed myself time to dwell upon it, I should no doubt have cut there and then, rushed back to my chamber, and bolted myself in. But whenever a danger or a horror is veiled with uncertainty, the primary wish of the mind is to ascertain first the naked truth, reserving the expedient of flight for the moment when its dread anticipation shall be realized. I turned the door-handle, and in an instant had crossed the fatal threshold, closed the door behind me, and stood in the presence of Madame Pelet. Gracious heavens! The first view of her seemed to confirm my worst apprehensions. There she sat, dressed out in a light green muslin gown, on her head a lace cap with flourishing red roses in the frill. Her table was carefully spread. There were fruits, cakes, and coffee, with a bottle of something, I did not know what. Already the cold sweat started on my brow. Already I glanced back over my shoulder at the closed door, when, to my unspeakable relief, my eye, wandering mildly in the direction of the stove, rested upon a second figure, seated in a large fauteuil beside it. This was a woman, too, and moreover an old woman, and as fat and as rubicund as Madame Pelet was meagre and yellow. Her attire was likewise very fine, and spring flowers of different hues circled in a bright wreath the crown of her violet-covered velvet bonnet. I had only time to make these general observations when Madame Pelet, coming forward with what she intended should be a graceful and elastic step, thus accosted me. Monsieur is indeed most obliging to quit his books, his studies, at the request of an insignificant person like me. Will Monsieur complete his kindness by allowing me to present him my dear friend, Madame Reuter, who resides in the neighboring house, the Young Ladies' School? Ah, thought I knew she was old. And I bowed and took my seat. Madame Reuter placed herself at the table opposite to me. How do you like Belgium, Monsieur? Asked she, in an accent of the broadest Bruxelles. I could now well distinguish the difference between the fine and pure Parisian utterance of Monsieur Pelet, for instance, and the guttural enunciation of the Flamands. I answered politely, and then wondered how so coarse and clumsy an old woman as the one before me should be at the head of a ladies' seminary, which I had always heard spoken of in terms of high commendation. In truth, there was something to wonder at. Madame Reuter looked more like a joyous, free-living old Flemish fermière, or even a maîtresse d'auberge, than a staid, grave, rigid directrice de pensionnat. In general, the continental, or at least the Belgian old women, permit themselves a license of manners, speech, and aspect, such as our venerable grandames would recoil from as absolutely disreputable, and Madame Reuter's jolly face bore evidence that she was no exception to the rule of her country. There was a twinkle and a leer in her left eye. Her right she kept habitually half shut, which I thought very odd indeed. After several vain attempts to comprehend the motives of these two droll old creatures for inviting me to join them at their goûter, I at last fairly gave it up, and resigning myself to inevitable mystification, I sat and looked first at one, then at the other, taking care meantime to do justice to the confitures, cakes, and coffee, with which they amply supplied me. They too ate, and that with no delicate appetite, and having demolished a large portion of the solids, they proposed a petit verre. I declined. Not so Mesdames Pelet and Reuter. Each mixed herself what I thought rather a stiff tumbler of punch, and placing it on a stand near the stove, they drew up their chairs to that convenience, and invited me to do the same. I obeyed, and being seated fairly between them, I was thus addressed first by Madame Pelet, and then by Madame Reuter. "We will now speak of business," said Madame Pelet, and she went on to make an elaborate speech, which, being interrupted, was to the effect that she had asked for the pleasure of my company that evening in order to give her friend Madame Reuter an opportunity of broaching an important proposal, which might turn out greatly to my advantage. Pourvu que vous soyez sage, said Madame Reuter, et à vrai dire, vous en avez bien l'air. Take one drop of punch, or punch, as she pronounced it. It is an agreeable and wholesome beverage after a full meal. I bowed, but again declined it. She went on. I feel, said she after a solemn sip, I feel profoundly the importance of the commission with which my dear daughter has entrusted me. For you are aware, monsieur, that it is my daughter who directs the establishment in the next house? Ah, I thought it was yourself, madame. Though indeed, at that moment, I recollected that it was called Mademoiselle, not Madame Reuter's pensionnat. I? Oh, no! I manage the house and look after the servants, as my friend Madame Pelet does for Monsieur her son. Nothing more. Ah, you thought I gave lessons in class, did you?" And she laughed loud and long, as though the idea tickled her fancy amazingly. "Madame is in the wrong to laugh," I observed. "If she does not give lessons, I am sure it is not because she cannot." And I whipped out a white pocket handkerchief and wafted it with a French grace past my nose, bowing at the name time. "Quel charmant jeune homme!" murmured Madame Pelet in a low voice. Madame Reuter, being less sentimental, as she was Flamand and not French, only laughed again. "You are a dangerous person, I fear," said she. "If you can forge compliments at that rate, Zoriad will positively be afraid of you. But if you are good, I will keep your secret, and not tell her how well you can flatter. Now listen what sort of a proposal she makes to you. She has heard that you are an excellent professor, and she wishes to get the very best masters for her school. Car Zoriad fait comme une reine, c'est une véritable maîtresse femme. She has commissioned me to step over this afternoon and sound Madame Pelet as to the possibility of engaging you. Zoriad is a wary general. She never advances without first examining well her ground. I don't think she would be pleased if she knew I had already disclosed her intentions to you. She did not order me to go so far, but I thought there would be no harm in letting you into the secret. And Madame Pelet was of the same opinion. Take care, however, you don't betray either of us to Zoriad, to my daughter, I mean. She is so discreet and circumspect herself, she cannot understand that one should find a pleasure in gossiping a little." "C'est absolument comme mon fils," cried Madame Pelet. "All the world is so changed since our girlhood," rejoined the other. "Young people have such old heads now. But to return, monsieur, Madame Pelet will mention the subject of your giving lessons in my daughter's establishment to her son, and he will speak to you. And then tomorrow you will step over to our house and ask to see my daughter, and you will introduce the subject as if the first intimation of it has reached you from Monsieur Pelet himself, and be sure you never mention my name, for I would not displease Zoriad on any account." "Bien, bien," interrupted I, for all this chatter and circumlocution began to bore me very much. "I will consult Monsieur Pelet, and the thing shall be settled as you desire. Good evening, mesdames. I am infinitely obliged to you." "Comment? Vous vous en allez déjà?" exclaimed Madame Pelet. "Prenez encore quelque chose, monsieur? Une pomme cuite, un biscuit, encore une tasse de café?" "Merci, merci, madame. Au revoir." And I backed at last out of the apartment. Having regained my own room, I set myself to turn over in my mind the incident of the evening. It seemed a queer affair altogether, and queerly managed. The two old women had made quite a little intricate mess of it. Still, I found that the uppermost feeling in my mind on the subject was one of satisfaction. In the first place, it would be a change to give lessons in another seminary, and then to teach young ladies would be an occupation so interesting. To be admitted at all into a ladies' boarding school would be an incident so new in my life. Besides, thought I, as I glanced at the boarded window, I shall now at last see the mysterious garden. I shall gaze both on the angels and their Eden. And that is where we are going to leave it for today. I apologize in advance. My French is not up to snuff. I'm currently learning, but I don't have that down yet. So if I butchered French, I am so sorry to anyone who does speak French. Join us next time for the exciting continuance of The Professor. Bye!